Okay. All right. So you can hear me, right?
Yep.
All right. Perfect. So a very warm welcome and good afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you are. This is the second of our sessions on executive remuneration and incentive design. We had a session about 2-3 weeks back. It was really well received. We had a lot of really good feedback. We will be sending out a form after this session, as well as to the ones that attended the previous session, just to get some feedback and thoughts from you. The intent is essentially exactly what it was last time. We will be talking a little bit about a particular topic. We'll raise it open and then we'll get some thoughts and feedback from you. I'm always open for any questions. We will be collecting the questions and answering some of them at the end of the session. So a little bit about myself, in case you didn't attend the previous session. My name is Indradeep. I have over 15 years of experience consulting large, medium, private organizations across Asia Pacific, US, UK, and more recently in India. A lot of my work is around executive compensation, incentive design, benchmarking of complex roles, designing pay for performance frameworks for organizations, and ultimately assisting organizations and management of the organization, which includes the CHRO, CFO, CEO, have meaningful conversations with the board of directors and ultimately preparing the board to have those conversations with the shareholders. So our role as executive remuneration consultants span across the boundary, across the various stakeholders, but also it's becoming increasingly more relevant when you think about what executive compensation is going towards from developing countries. So India largely is on the cusp of where you're going to see a lot more corporate governance come in, a lot more relevant stakeholders and shareholders being vocal about how much compensation is being paid to the senior people. So this is basically an attempt to talk about some of the best practices and some of the ways in which you think about executive compensation as I've experienced them in the last 15 years across the globe. And I want to bring some of that to you. Obviously, I want to learn from you as to whether this is relevant or you've had some other thoughts. But this is meant to be an attempt by me to present what I've learned over the last 15 years. So the intent of the session, this session is meant to give you an overall insight about how STI plans operate. So STI meaning short-term incentives. What are some of the key considerations and what kind of a view do we need when we are designing short-term incentive plans? So what's the holistic view? We keep hearing and we keep talking about when we're designing an incentive plan, we need to think about multiple factors, not just what is the market, not just where are we as a business. Why do we need to do that? So we'll talk about and hopefully touch on some of the critical parts of consideration when you are designing a short-term incentive plan. However, what this session isn't is actual market practice for obvious reasons, right? Because you all come in from different organizations, so we do not have enough coverage to be able to do it in a meaningful manner. How do you actually design and solve for the different considerations? Again, that is very business specific. That is very specific to the problem that you're trying to solve, and the implementation. So when you've designed the short-term incentive plan, how do you actually implement it? What are the comms? What are the FAQs? What are the plan rules? What are the offer letters? And finally, stakeholder management and governance. So how do you manage stakeholders and what's the proper governance as to who approves, who signs off, whose line of authority is it, whose signing off authority is it? So these actual elements will not be covered in this particular session. We will be running more sessions, and I'll talk to that at the end, where we will be getting into a little bit more detail about these, but this is meant to be a top level for people who either have designed short-term incentives or are accountable for designing short-term incentive, implementing short-term incentive, managing short-term incentive. This session is more for you to take that away from here so that you can go back to your organizations and start thinking a little bit about what does this mean and how do we start implementing, how do we start designing for some of these considerations. If you're not already doing that in the organization, again, this is a really good opportunity to stop and to look at this and go, well, is this actually the best way we are designing? Could there be another way in which we can get through the short-term incentive design? What are we actually trying to solve for? So let's look at some basic points about short-term incentive, right? So firstly, it's an annual program. What it means is it typically is aligned to your annual performance cycle, your financial year. So some organizations go from April to March, some organizations go from Jan to December, some organizations go from July to June, some organizations go from October to September. So depending on where your financial cycle is, the short-term incentive is an annual program that starts on day one of your financial cycle and finishes on day 365 of your financial cycle. So it's an annual program, it's a 1-year program. It's meant to incentivize most or all of the organization. But the important part is in delivering annual business objectives. So what I mean by that, when I talk about annual business objectives, is your organization has a strategy. Typically, that strategy is over a 3 to 5 year period. That strategy is broken down into annual objectives. So the annual objectives should technically, in best case scenario, be aligned with your short-term incentives so that the incentive program incentivizes either all of the organization or at least a large part of the organization in delivering the annual business objectives, right? So whatever the annual objectives are, this program is meant to incentivize delivery of that. Now, the reason why this is not for all the organization sometimes is because the rest of the organization is often part of a sales incentive program, which is something that we'll be covering in the next couple of weeks. But this is not, short-term incentive is not a sales incentive program. Typically, the non-sales people are part of the short-term incentive. It starts from the CEO and cascades down pretty much to really deep within the organization, barring the sales employees. So bear that in mind when we do talk about sales incentive program. We'll talk about what the differences are and why certain group of people are better suited for a short-term incentive versus a sales incentive. Generally, when you're talking about a short-term incentive plan, you're either talking about a top-down structure or a bottom-up structure. A top-down structure is also known as a profit-sharing model. So essentially, the way it works is at the end of a performance cycle, as in 12 months, the total profit of the organization is determined as a result of scorecards, as a result of just financial measurements. And that profit, which is your EBIT number, EBITDA number, or NPAT number, that creates a pool that is known as the incentive pool. That pool then gets distributed among individuals based on their individual performance. And a bottom up is more like a corporate scorecard. So a corporate scorecard has, or a balanced scorecard has multiple KPIs in it. So depending on how those KPIs could be individual or could be a group level, based on the performance against those KPIs, a certain payout happens. Typically, it's one of these two models. They have pros and cons. And again, I thought this would be a bit too detailed for this conversation. But when we have the more detailed STI session, we will be discussing and taking you through an example of how a top-down and a bottom-up program operates and what the pros and cons are. But if you think about it, a top-down is more simplistic because it's just one profit number that gets divvied up. A bottom-up is more advanced, more modern, takes into account risk, financial management. So it's a bit more all-encompassing. So that is a top-level view, but there's at least another 5 or 6 differences that we'll take you through when we go through the more advanced session. The most important thing to consider, or the most important issue to consider when you're designing a short-term incentive, is how the measures interplay with the achievement, performance, KPI, and the line of sight. So think about at the high end of the organization, right? So the CEO and the executive team, they have more line of sight towards achievement of business objectives, strategic group-wide business objectives. Whereas if you think about further below, as you go down in the organization, they are more accountable for their actual actions. So depending on which model you use, whether it's a top-down or a bottom-up, as you cascade down through the organization, the KPIs or the weighting of the KPIs change as well. So the further up you are in the organization, more weightage there is on group-wide measures. Lower down in the organization, more weighting is given towards individual measures. But when I say more weighting, what does that mean? Is it 70-30, 80-20, 60-40? Some of that is industry-based, some of that is sector-based, but some of that is also at what point does your organization, like what is the span and layer? At what point does your organization have more delivery focus? Where is the strategy line cut off? How deep does the organization go? So it's a little bit of understanding of where your organization is, as well as looking at what's happening in your sector and your industry to determine some of these weightings, which is exactly the reason why we're not going to go into that detail, but we'll just talk about some of the basic considerations, design principles that will help you hopefully as you continue thinking about how to work with short-term incentives. So having a look at that, the way I design short-term incentive plans is I break it down into a few core elements. The first one is a business strategy and outlook. So what's the business stage of your organization? What does that mean, business? What do I mean by business stage? What I mean is, are you a high growth? Are you a maturity? Are you a transaction based? Are you an M&A focused? Do you have large scale divestment strategies? Do you have investment into Southeast Asia? Do you have mergers with North America? So all of this has a really interesting flow on effect from a short-term incentive program. Now, it would get too detailed, and therefore I'm not going into that exactly. But if you think about, I'll give you an example just to help you think through this. So if you're a startup, you're obviously probably cash constrained. You're probably looking at more revenue than you're looking at profit. The kind of people you've got in your organizations is probably more sales and delivery focused. They are probably more deeper in their experience rather than broader in their experience, right? So when you're talking about all these different stages of the organization and what the organization is going through, that has an impact on the short-term incentive. So rather than look at what your competitor is doing, it doesn't really make sense. It doesn't actually, market data makes not as much sense. It obviously is a good relevant point, and you should be looking at that, but it's not the be all and end all, because when you think about what your competitors are doing, you're naturally thinking about trying to adopt something that they are doing. But by definition, your business strategy is unique. So you should have a design, you should design a short-term incentive plan that works for you. Now, a lot of the people I've spoken to who are based in India, I've heard them say that their short-term incentive plan is designed by a global office. It's been designed by an international headquartered office because they are more like the Indian business unit. But I strongly disagree. I think even if you are a global multinational corporation, there is definite opportunity for you to have a look at how your business unit is operating. The budget may be determined. I agree with that. But the structure, every market is different. The things that incentivize people from India would not be the same things that incentivize people from Dubai, from the US, from UK. Culturally, every place has a different way of incentivizing and compensating people, and that should play a part in this. The next thing I look at is your sector undergoing massive changes? Like, what's happening with your sector? Did COVID have a big impact? Is work from home becoming a big thing? Is your sector undergoing contraction? Is your sector undergoing adjacent sector expansion? Is your sector undergoing big organizations merging into small? Because what's happening within your sector naturally has an impact on your business strategy. And the way I look at it, and the way we've been discussing this, business strategy is the driver for your short-term incentive. Market data is a support to that. And then what's your business outlook for the next few years? More importantly, what is it for the next year? So how do you get to that point in the next few years, and what are you going to do for this year to get to that point? Now, business objectives, if you think about strategies, there's probably going to be 10, 15 strategies. Now, those strategies by themselves cannot form part of your corporate scorecard, because firstly, there's too many of them. Secondly, not all strategies are meant to be for over a 1 year period, because any strategy that you've got, it could be that, okay, we need to get there in 2 years. So do we have enough well-established, well-understood deliverables, well-understood milestones along the 1 year period? They are also important factors for you to consider. The next thing I look at is your talent needs. Where do you hire talent from? Where do you lose talent? What's the demography of your workforce? Now, I'm doing a really interesting project right now where one of my clients is paying a lot of money to their general workforce. By general workforce, I mean customer-facing workforce. So it's not really a sales incentive kind of framework, but it's more like a in between a short-term incentive and a sales incentive program. Now, these people are getting paid a lot of incentive. But when you actually look at what they're after, the demography of the workforce does not require that much discretionary payment. They would much rather have a larger base and less of a discretionary payment or less of a short-term incentive. So keeping that in mind, it's really important for you to consider what's the talent market saying. We need to design a short-term incentive that works for our strategy, that works for our workforce. What do they value? Obviously, this is going to play a part in your employer value proposition as well. This is going to play a part in your total reward strategy as well. But have a think about which levers you have and which levers do you want to pull, because everything that you do has a opportunity cost. Everything that you do has a cost benefit analysis that you need to perform. So my recommendation, again, when I do this with clients, is have a think about your talent. Have a think about where you're going to get your talent from and what does that group value. The next thing I look at is what culture are you trying to promote within your organization? Do you want to promote collaboration, or do you want to promote pay for performance? If you promote collaboration, then how do you incentivize people to go out and perform above and beyond? And if you promote a strict differentiated pay for performance culture, then how do you actually promote collaboration? Because your plans, your incentive programs need to talk to one another. You need to talk to the culture that you're trying to promote. So if you've got a collaboration culture, then there has to be weightage on team-based KPIs. If you're promoting pay for performance, then there has to be individual ways by which pay for performance and individual performance gets significantly incentivized. So as an example, you could have pay for performance where the individual performance becomes a multiplier, where how much you perform, your whole bonus program could get cranked up. But if that kind of a construct is there for a collaboration-based culture, where again, this talks to the talent peer group that you have, this talks to the business strategy that you have, this talks, everybody wants collaboration, everybody wants pay for performance. But what does it actually mean? On an individual level, how are you going to incentivize people? So there's techniques and methods. And again, the intent of this is not to make it overly simplistic. I'm just saying the kind of things that we have to talk about. As an example, just to answer that particular question is a 2-hour session with the CEO, CFO, the group executive levels, and the CHRO. It takes me 2 hours to just get to the bottom of that one particular question, because it has significant meaning from a construction and design perspective. So we can't just be really blasé about it. We can't just really say, okay, let's just go collaboration. Yeah, we want everyone to be happy. We want everyone to be part of a team. We want everyone to be part of a family. Yeah, really? Is that what this thing is saying? Like, are there ways in which you can get collaboration, but from an incentive perspective, is it collaboration more or differentiated performance more? KPIs or measures. This is where this section of the KPIs or measures needs to talk about, if you remember a couple of slides back, when I was talking about your line of sight. So which KPIs do people have control over? Do they have a line of sight over? Which KPIs are individual? Which KPIs are group? Which KPIs are team? Which KPIs are financial versus non-financial? Which KPIs are lead versus lag? So financial KPIs are obvious ones, right? That's what the company is providing back to the shareholders. But think about triple bottom line reporting. This concept started about 15, 20 years back, and now this has led to the evolution of ESG measures. Yes, we have a duty of care towards our shareholders, but is that all? What about the duty of care that we have for our customers? What about the duty of care that we have towards our environment, towards our employees? So we need to make sure that everything that we are building towards, everything that we are creating, everything that we are constructing has a value. We cannot be one-sided when we're thinking about that. All right. So the next part, what instruments? Can I just pause for 1 second? I think there's a battery problem. Just give me 1 second. No, that's fine. Yep. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, we can see.
Yeah, okay.
If you can go on the presentation mode into the
Yeah, I will. Is it recording?
Yes, it is.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, guys. I heard a battery low and I thought it was my battery, but it's probably not. All right. And then what instruments are you proposing for your team? Is it cash? Is it phantom shares? Is it actual shares? Is it performance rights? Is it options? Is it RSUs, what kind of instrument works. And that consideration is a combined consideration when you think about what do your competitors pay. So obviously we're looking at the market, but also what do your employees prefer? Do you want employees to have skin in the company? Certain companies are obviously not listed. Fair enough. But for the listed organizations, or when your motherhood company is listed, then do you want your employees to have skin in the game? What's that percent that you would be happy with for them to have skin in the game? And how does this work with our employee value proposition? So you see, even designing these core sort of top level questions or answering these top level questions is not easy. Each one of them has a really well thought out. It's not just what the market is doing. It's not just where we are going. It's not just what we want our employees to do, but this is a holistic overall version, which basically leads you to having a more well thought out plan, a more well argued upon conversation for the rest of the organization, so that anything you design is well aligned, has a good line of sight, the KPIs are well structured, and ultimately it gets to a point where people are incentivized. There's a differentiated pay for performance. There's a culture that promotes pay for performance, and everything is in sync. So the intent for today is to just talk about some of these top level considerations that you might think about when you're designing the short-term incentive. And if you already have a short-term incentive, have a think about how these things work within your organization. Yeah. The next thing that I always talk about is a gateway or not. So what do I mean by a gateway? So when I'm talking about a gateway, I'm talking about a switch, basically a 0 or a 1. So a gateway allows you to basically have no payout. So there could be risk, there could be brand, there could be fatality, there could be accidents. So if these kind of scenarios happen, then maybe for the whole organization, or maybe for a specific group within the organization, there is no payout. Doesn't matter what's happened with the rest of the scorecard, doesn't matter what's happened with the rest of the financial, non-financial performance, no one gets paid anything. Do you want that structure? What culture is that going to promote? Does that specify to the rest of the world that actually we are really serious about these few things? If our brand reputation takes a hit, then guess what? The executive team, no one gets paid anything. Yes, probably further down in the organization, you can still have a more relaxed approach. What about profit? If our profit number is not hit, well, we don't have money to pay out. So if you don't have money to pay out, then obviously that becomes a gateway for this. Deferral of STI. Do you want to defer your STI part of your STI? So how do you actually, so let's say you have at the end of a performance period, you have $100, $20 out of that you want to defer out for a future. The reason why you want to defer for the future is because at that stage you have a retention question. So how do you retain people? Or you want to incentivize people to kick up that performance, right? So let's say you have $100, $20 gets deferred. There's an opportunity for that $20 to even increase further on, right? So it's not just what you get paid now, but it's also what you get paid for the future. What instrument do you have? Is it cash? Is it options? Is it rights? Is it shares? What's the mechanism? Like could it go up? Could it go down? And how do you enable people to grow opportunities? So this way you have got people over and over again to basically work with your company, but not only do they get an incentive now, they also have an opportunity to increase the incentive further on. So this is where it starts getting really exciting for the organization, because this is where you have people who are really motivated for the annual performance, but then they continue being motivated for the tail of the short-term incentive, for what's coming beyond that. Final thing that I would consider when I'm talking about short-term incentive is malice, clawback, and change in control. These are three really important mechanisms. Malice, clawback are two control mechanisms that an organization have. A malice is when there is an award that's been made and you have been awarded that, but it has not yet been transferred to you. So you know that, okay, you've got $100, but you still haven't got that money. Clawback is when you've got that money. Under both scenarios, organizations can actually take that money back. Generally, it happens when there's fraud, when there's misstatement, when there's behavioral issue that comes up later on, but you need to make sure that you have consideration to malus clawback, and then a change in control. So typically what happens for a change in control, and this is more relevant from an equity design perspective, but it's still relevant from a short-term incentive. So when there's a change in control, as in change in ownership control, then the plan is no longer relevant. The plan stops becoming relevant. You know why? Because the plan was for us to have a one-year strategy, and this is what the strategy was. 9 months into the plan, into the year, there's a change in control. We now have been acquired by another company. So guess what? Our old strategy is no longer relevant. So what happens when there is a change in control? Does it mean that we have accelerated vesting? Does it mean that we stop the plan and start again? But people have been already working for 9 months. So what's the right thing to do? And more importantly, what triggers the change in control? There are a lot of organizations, whether it's India or anywhere, where there are people who have, there are families that own large companies. But if the family doesn't want to sell down and the families do not want to vote on matters, they probably have a board seat. Sometimes they have 2 board seats. But if they don't want to sell down, but the other members who own part of the company, they want to sell down, does that trigger a change in control? Does it have to be a minimum 50% control? So there are pros and cons. There are ways in which you should think about it. But again, this is not a solution. This is more like the considerations, right? So if you do have a short-term incentive plan, have a think about whether you have these design elements within your short-term incentive: malus, clawback, change in control, in addition to gateway, right? So typically a compliance-based element. That's why I've put all of this on this particular slide. What's the compliance element? What's the risk management from your short-term incentive plan? Okay. Once you've designed your short-term incentive, when you now want to look at how this all plays out, there's a performance calibration that we often need to do. When you're thinking about performance calibration, it's talking about what happens at the end of the 1-year period when the performance ratings are out. Do you have a forced distribution, or do you just let it fall out and then it is what it is? Now, my recommendation, and when I work with organizations, is that you should not have a forced distribution, but you should have a hypothesis about how a particular business unit is performing, depending on the rating, performance rating of the EXCO, and an analysis that's been done by the CEO. So often I would sit down with the CEO and I would say, okay, Mr. CEO, Mrs. CEO, or Miss CEO, you've got these 6 or 7 business units. How do you want to rate the executive member that's leading the 6 or 7 business units? In addition to that, this is what the KPIs were. This is how much money they've made. Now, not all business units make money. There are service-oriented business units as well. So this is how much they've made money. This is how much their year-on-year performance has been. How do you rate that? Now, for obvious reasons, the executives that get a higher rating, but on a relative scale, they should have a more skewed performance distribution for the rest of the team. So I start with the EXCO, then I have a hypothesis around how I want the various performance curves to come out. It depends on how your rating system is set up, and some organizations have got rid of rating systems altogether. But if you have a 5-point rating system, in my definition, 1 is basically did not qualify, like wasn't there long enough to perform. 2 is you're on a performance curve, as in like we're having conversations with you. You are either going to up your game or be out of the organization. A 3 is what I would consider an average. A 4 is when I'm thinking, well, this is really truly above and beyond. And a 5 is very limited. I would say 7 to 10%, 5 to 7 to 10% of the organization would get a 5. The reason why I say that is, and this is very personal, it kind of depends on how your performance system talks to your reward system. So if you have a system like this where there's only 5, 7, 10% people getting a 5, then that has to be supported by a reward framework where individual performance means that you're almost about to get 30%. So a 5 would get a 30%, 40% more than a 4. And a 4 would probably get a 25% more than a 3. So you can't never in compensation, particularly in compensation design, can you build one framework without having regard to the other. So when you're designing the performance framework, you need to think about the reward and the other way around. What kind of performance culture are we promoting, and what does that mean? Where are we going with all this? When you're talking about a top-down, I discussed this, but I'll just, as it is a design consideration, I think it's worth having a quick look at this. So you have an initial scorecard. It could be the same scorecard for the top down or the bottom up. That scorecard could be a blend of financial, non-financial measures, could be a blend of lead and lag indicators, could be a blend of group, business unit, individual, team KPIs. But once you, depending on how you perform against that corporate scorecard, a profit pool gets distributed or created. So at the end of the period, you look at all that and you go, okay, right, you've got a $10 million profit pool. Now that $10 million profit pool then gets divvied up into the different business units, depending on how the performance calibration has been, depending on how many people there are, and depending on what their salary is, right? So think about it, business units with more people should get more profit pool distribution. People having a 5 should get paid more. People who are on a higher salary should get a higher bonus, not because they've performed well, but because bonuses are typically a % of the salary. So if your salary is $100,000 and you have 30% bonus, and somebody's salary is $80,000 and they have a 20% bonus, then irrespective of how you perform, your opportunity to perform on a dollar basis is higher, right? So you use all of these principles, you reverse engineer, and you come up with, okay, a 5 in this business unit gets this, a 5 in this business unit gets this, a 5 in this business unit gets this. Now, if you see that there isn't too much of a difference, then you could merge it all, saying a 5 within the company could get this. But all of that, again, comes down to nitty-gritties and details that is probably a bit of an overkill for a session like this. But from a structure perspective, you get a profit pool that depends on a scorecard. Individuals get individual ratings, and through the calibration, as I've discussed earlier, your ratings get moderated, and then the pool gets distributed to individuals. A bottom up, on the other hand, is where you have a corporate scorecard, an individual rating, and the corporate scorecard determines your independent or individual payout, right? So the previous one, once the profit pool is distributed, then we don't care about the organization performance. We only care about our performance. Whereas for a bottom up, the corporate scorecard and the individual together determines your individual payout. And then obviously at the end of everything, the CEO and the executive team goes through this and fine tunes what payout is logical. You could have, as a reward and compensation person, you could put in guidelines saying that, okay, you can't go above this, you can't go below this. But at the end of the day, it's still a decision that the CEO and the executive team should own. So there are some of the themes that are coming up, emerging trends, as I like to call it. These emerging trends and themes that have been coming up in the last 2 or 3 years are quite interesting for you to note. Should you consider, well, what's the impact on our short-term incentive? We haven't reviewed a short-term incentive in 2 to 3 years. Should we be doing it? Most certainly you should, because the market's moved on. People have moved on, the talent market's moved on, and I can pretty much guarantee a business strategy is no longer the same. So particularly after COVID, and as regulatory regimes tighten, and this is one of my big pet peeves, I think in India, and as you'll see in most of the other developing nations, the regulatory regimes will tighten quite a bit. Corporate governance will become really important. Say on pay will become important. Pay for performance will become important. And we can no longer rely upon salary surveys, and we can no longer rely upon, or this is what I've heard others do, but we need to really have a subjective and a holistic view towards the design of compensation packages, particularly for the executives, because that's where the most noise will be. But kind of things that are becoming important, deferral periods are definitely becoming important. So previously, you would get a payment at the end of the year, cash and finish. Now it's no longer cash and finish. Now it's at the end of the period, part of the money gets deferred. As I mentioned, for retention purposes, to grow your money, the opportunity to grow the money further. And the third point is also it's linked to malus and clawback, because if the money is not paid, it's a lot easier for the company to take that money back rather than when the money is paid. Malus and clawback, really important. It's getting more and more relevant from a short-term incentive. Previously, there used to be more on a long-term incentive, but now even short-term incentives getting really popular. Previously, it used to be only CEO and CFO. Now it's cascading down to the rest of the exec team and some of the other roles from risk, audit, control, financial, treasury. Some of those roles are also starting to have malus and clawback. Non-financial measures, for obvious reasons, it's no longer about satisfying the shareholder. There's a duty of care we have towards the rest of the economy, towards the rest of the society, towards the rest of the customer, population, our next generation, leaving a legacy behind. So non-financial measures are typically measures like your customer measure, your employee engagement measures, your strategic measures, your any kind of milestone that you're hitting, any kind of market penetration that you're doing, any kind of risk that's happening. How do you measure them? How do you accurately measure them? And what's a good yard and benchmark? That comes second. Let's first work out what's relevant for us, and then we can see whether we can measure it or not. That's always been my approach. Absolutely, we need to make sure that what we recommend can actually be measured, but that's secondary. First, let's see whether this is an important thing for us or not. Now, we might decide, for example, employee engagement is really important, but we don't have money to invest in an employee engagement survey. Okay, well, is there anything that we can do internally? Is there anything that we can measure? Not necessarily as an employee engagement, but what about things like turnover? Turnover is something that we should be able to measure with or without an HRIS system. So again, let's work out the themes that is important from the business, from the 1-year annual objectives. Again, the KPIs and the measures should not change year on year. It's okay to have a little bit of a steer. So you could change one measure, maybe half a measure, but things like EBITDA, free cash flow, NPAT, sales revenue, these are things that the targets, the underlying targets, the numbers could change, but the measures should be as relevant and as fixed as you possibly can get. ESG measures, we've discussed a little bit about that. That's becoming important as well. So just like you have non-financial measures, but measures which are more related to ESG, particularly if you're in certain sector, particularly if you are in certain business growth stage, ESG measures really important. Pay for performance, I can't overstress this. Pay for performance is fundamental now in any boardroom. I attend anywhere between 3 to 4 board meetings in a week for various organizations all across the globe. The number one thing that they talk about, that the directors and the chair of the REMCO or the chair of the PRC or the chair of the board talks about and wants us to get involved with, is a pay for performance. Just because you're getting paid a lot doesn't mean that that's a bad thing. And even if you get paid $1 over and above, your fixed pay needs to be justified by a performance that is then calibrated against what your competitors are doing and how that ultimately leads to creating shareholder value and an overall contribution to the economy. These questions are very easily asked. They're extremely complex to answer, particularly in the absence of real-time data, but we have to have a mindset where we start contemplating some of these elements as we start designing, redesigning, relooking at our existing short-term incentive plans. Capped payout again. So we have not spoken about a stretch or a maximum payout or a threshold payout, but the concept is that although you have target numbers which are based on your budget, if you achieve a little bit lower than that, which is known as the threshold, you should get paid a little bit. And if you go above that, you should be paid a little bit more. So if your target opportunity is 30%, you should be able to get a little bit more above that, maybe another 20% on that. So 36% or 40% on a 30% base as a stretch or a maximum. But what is not okay is to not have a cap on that. Because just like a sales incentive plan, I keep hearing, oh, we don't need a cap on this. There is no good that can come up from uncapping a KPI. The reason is, if you can get your target setting in place, then you know how much is possible. And if it's in a proper business environment, it's really hard to go above and beyond a certain point. When can you go above and beyond a certain point? Number one, when there's been a windfall, as in when there's been some financial gain to your organization which does not have your contribution. Should you get paid for that? I don't think so. Secondly, when there's been a miscalculation of your target, don't you think you should hold the business accountable for setting targets? It cannot be that hard to set a target. I know it's not that straightforward either. I've worked with a lot of CFOs in setting budgets, but that is fundamental responsibility of a CFO or a CEO or a group exec. And the third one is, invariably there's been some behavioral issues, which may not come up early on, but it will. So if you decide to have an uncapped payout mechanism, whether that's for your short-term incentive or for your sales incentive, you need to make sure that your regulatory governance and compliance frameworks are really solid, strong, and you can think of all the unintended behaviors and their consequences and how you're able to control them. All right, so that is pretty much what I wanted to discuss at a top level. I'll not take too much time for this, but as you see, there are 3 types of sessions we'll start working on. The first one is every 2 or 3 weeks. It's 50 to 60 members of the audience, and it's a 45-minute discussion with some Q&A. And there are various topics there that you see over there. I'm not going to read them out. We are going to have some more workshops, which are going to be more hand-holding, more detailed, and where we open up our toolkit and start sharing some of our real-life examples. And that's going to be on a shorter group. And we will be talking about things like LTI basics and LTI expert if you want to become an expert in long-term incentive. So not just talking about strategy and how the HR and the PNC team work together with finance, but basically getting into the nitty-gritty, getting into the numbers, opening up how do the performance right work with an options. And then the third thing we're also starting is corporate training. So this is for the organization. We walk into the organization and we spend some time, generally over a couple of 2-hour sessions, and we talk about various things relevant to the organization. So it's specific to the organization. We custom build it for the organization, and we spend some time with that. There are certain other stuff that we're working on. If you're interested in any of them, please reach out to us. We will also contact you at the end of this. Sorry, it went out a bit quicker. So we are going to have salary service for executive roles. We are going to be helping out on ad hoc basis for executive benchmarking and certain off-the-shelf product plan rules templates. And if you need any help on REM consulting basis. So I'm just going to stop sharing for the moment because I know that there are quite a few questions and I want to make sure that I give it enough time. All right. So, do you want to have any questions?
I guess there are certain questions which has been asked in the chat. So Shankar is asking, how do we ensure that our STI plans is in line with our org growth and projections?
Yep. So that's a really good question. I think so the way I look at it is your organization will have a vision and mission. It will also have business strategies that are set over a 3 to 5 year period. That then cascades down to what it is that we need to meet for the first year, right? So very rarely will an organization actually not have a 1-year growth projections. But before you do that, when you start thinking about what it is that your organization would be working on, think about what are the big key topics and the key facts that are being discussed in the organization. Do they talk about cash flow? Do they talk about profit numbers? Do they talk about sales numbers? Do they talk about diversification strategy? Do they talk about what is the organization DNA talking to you? The more you listen to that, the more you'll get a hint as to, okay, these kind of things are really important for our organization, right? So when I talk about growth projections, I'm talking about these numbers coming straight out of budget, but ultimately whether these numbers are relevant to you or not will also depend on what is it that drives the DNA of the business? What is it that drives the value creation of the business? What is it that you keep hearing the CEO talk about? What keeps coming up in the meetings that your manager or the CEO comes down to you and say, when you're hiring people, what does your EVP talk about? Those are guidelines for you to know that you've got the right measures. Forget the target, but at least the right measures. So that will generally enable you to ensure that your growth projections are aligned to your STI KPIs. But other than that, from a structure perspective, the STI plan also needs to support growth projections, because certain growth projections means you need certain kind of people. And certain kind of people get excited with certain kind of structure. For example, cash versus equity. For example, a lower base but a higher STI opportunity. For example, leverage. So how much can you outperform? For example, focus on teamwork. So these are all elements that talk to specific kinds of people that will come in from your growth projections and the type of talent you're going for. Does that answer your question, Shankar? Okay. Shall we just go on to the next one?
Yeah, Mehndi, you there, if you can unmute yourself and ask the question. I believe asking that question would be too long for me to spell it out.
Yeah.
Unmute yourself, Mehndi, and you can ask the question to Indradeep.
Thank you for organizing this session. So I have a couple of questions. One is there are many companies, they are moving actually from their rating system. So in that case, how would you recommend incentivizing employees? Because there is no individual rating system. And
Yeah,
many
correct.
Fortune 500 companies, they're actually moving out of the rating system. That's one question I asked. And another question, due to, sometimes we have seen that due to natural disaster or like COVID, the business didn't perform as per the target. So in that
Yes.
case, employees put their due efforts, but what should companies do in that case? Because employees expect incentives, but sometimes the company management team, they say simply that companies are not achieving the targets. So as they are not making money, so what should we do? But employees, they expect reward for the
Of course.
due effort. So
Of
that's
course, 100%.
yeah, that's a
100%.
yeah, that's number 2 question. And number 3, does individual incentive skill agility and team-based effort? Because in companies now are moving to agile concepts, most of the companies. So in that case, what is your suggestion? So these are the 3
Yeah.
questions.
They are really, really good questions. Can I call you Mehdi? Is that the easiest way to call you?
Yes, you can
Okay,
call
so
me.
they're all 3 are really good questions, Mehdi. I think the first thing, and I'll just try and answer these in the order you've asked me. So yes, there are organizations who are removing any kind of rating system. What that means is they are not relying upon a rating system. However, if we actually look at what that means from an implementation perspective, they still have some kind of a mechanism, which is not necessarily a rating system, but it could be some other way in which they are managing and tracking performance. The first thing that you've got to realize is performance management, firstly, is a separate exercise to a reward framework. A reward and performance framework needs to talk to one another, but it doesn't mean that they always need to talk to one another and they only need to talk to one another. So whether you have a reward framework or you have any incentive payout, performance in itself, by itself, should constantly be monitored, should be tracked, and conversations should be had by managers and their team members regarding performance. So let's get that concept first firmed up. If that's where you're going, then you don't necessarily need a rating system. You could have a discretionary payment. So if you think about the profit pool that we mentioned and how it cascades down, all you need to know is that you've got, as a manager, you've got $30,000. You distribute it among the people. You don't need a rating system. It's entirely discretionary. But there are guidelines which say that if you distribute it in a certain fashion, that basically tells me in a reverse engineering fashion what their ratings are. So you don't actually need ratings to have performance-based payout, but whether you have a rating or it's a discretionary payout, performance conversations should happen anyways. And if there is no performance-based payout, formulaic payout, but you're still having a discretionary payout, as long as you can control the biases, as in favoritism, nepotism, or whatever the biases are, as long as you're able to control that, the way in which you distribute the money is also a clear indication to us as to how you value those team members. So if there's somebody who's getting really high payout every time as a percent of their base salary or TFR or whatever, total fixed salary, and then third year they get a really drop, that to me is an indication that I need to sit down and have a chat with the manager. So that's your first question. The second one is, when organizations do not make profit, should they pay out? So that's a really interesting question, which is why I think it depends on how much of a profit they've missed. If their profit targets were $100 million and they hit $50 million, then unfortunately the company has no money. They're probably going to go bankrupt. They can't afford to pay their employees. But if the profit was 100 million and you've reached 90 million or 95 million, then of course you should be paying out. And you could have a scenario, which is why I mentioned the concept of threshold, target, and stretch. So at the threshold, which is 90%, 95% of the target, if you hit that, you should still have or budget for certain amount of money to be paid. Not everyone gets paid their whole target opportunity, but maybe they get paid 50% of their target opportunity. Or you look at that 50% of the opportunity and you say, this whole money I'm just going to give out to the top performers because we don't have money. So you should still be paying out, and employees do expect something. But look, I mean, if the target was 100 billion and you've hit $50 million and that profit is just going to go away in the fixed cost and everything else in the next couple of months, you actually don't have money. So I think it's less a question of principle of design, but it's more like, do you have the money to afford? If you do have the money to afford, very simply, yes, you should pay out. And then it becomes a question of, do you pay out at the executive level? Do you pay out all levels, or do you start at the low level? And that comes down to the culture and DNA and what the exec team would like to drive. So very often as a REM or compensation consultant, our job is not to answer these questions. Our job is to create a framework for decision-making that we can then take to the exco and say, okay, right, this is the problem. These are your 3 options. This is what option number 1 means. This is how much it's going to cost you. Let's have a chat. And it's your call, CEO, Mr. CEO, Mrs. CEO, it's your call. You tell me what you want to do. We can only guide you through that. But yes, in my experience, organizations have done all 3 of them. They've decided that we're going to pay out a lower amount for a lot of people, or we're going to pay out the target amount for a small group of people. And when we have no money whatsoever, unfortunately, we're not going to pay out anything, but there might be a 6-monthly discretionary payout rather than you having to wait for 12 months. And then the final question that you have about individual incentives and whether that kills agility and team-based effort. Look, I mean, if you just have individual performance, and let's say that's weighted on 50%, 60%, and you have nothing else in your EVP, then yes, it will kill team-based effort. But if you balance it with other elements that you can design in your EVP, then no, it will not kill. Because individual performance by definition means what you are doing. And if I set a team-based KPI in your individual performance, so it doesn't mean that how much has the team performed. It's more like what have you done in relation to your team-based effort. So you could have an individual performance that you have to support cross-sell 20%. You have to support solving 20% of the other person's programming bugs. You have to support introducing the rest of your team to other members, whatever that is, depending on the function and the role that you're in. But you could almost always build in a team-based element in your individual performance. And at the end of the day, there's always a what and a how, remember? So the what is the more mathematical, numerical element. So you could have individual performance there, but the how is how you do it. And that's the value, that's the non-formulaic art part of incentive design. So don't underestimate the how. As a matter of fact, the how weights more than the what in most of the incentive designs that I have worked on. So if you think about a 2x2 matrix and you have what here and a how here, you'll see that there's more weighting on the how. So a 2-1 on the how is higher than a 1-2 on the what, if that makes sense. So 2 points on the how, 1 point on the what is higher than 1 point on the how and 2 points on the what. That means there's more weightage on the how. So you can't design everything to formula, but what you can do is take a step back and design the whole thing through a holistic approach, which is exactly why it's known as a total reward strategy. You can design the short-term incentives in isolation, but it needs to talk to the total reward strategy, which ultimately needs to talk to your organizational growth objectives. Does that answer your question, Mehdi?
Yeah, Indrodeep, I think you have nicely explained. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay. Perfect. Anything else? All right. If there's nothing else, thank you all for attending. I really enjoy these kind of sessions and having these conversations. My name, phone number, and LinkedIn profile was mentioned right at the end, right at the beginning. On the first slide, we will be sharing this on YouTube, and so all of you will get it. I would really encourage each one of you to provide some kind of a feedback to us so we can keep improving these presentations and sessions. And as you saw, if there's anything that you saw on the deck that you want to talk more about or are interested in pursuing more, feel free to reach out to us and we will get in touch with you. All righty. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of the evening, and I look forward to speaking with you soon.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.